Kim, what's on your radar today?
Well, today I want to take you on a little history walking tour. So as you may have heard, Joe Biden has announced he will be keeping 6,000 troops in Afghanistan until he evacuates all stranded Americans, even if this means staying beyond the August 31st deadline. Now, is this just another presidential broken promise to end war after declaring it's finally over? We're going to have to wait and see if Biden keeps his promise of truly ending the war in Afghanistan. But if he doesn't, he'd be keeping up with the long tradition of American presidents promising to end or not engage in wars and failing to follow through. Now, we'll start this tour with Woodrow Wilson. In 1916, he won re-election by campaigning on keeping America out of World War I. People wore buttons with slogans splashed across them like, "He has kept us out of war," and "Peace in America, God bless Wilson." But 1 year later, Wilson entered the U.S. into World War I. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson swore up and down he would not send young American boys to do, quote, what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves. But by the end of 1964, Johnson had sent 23,000 military personnel to Vietnam. And by 1967, nearly 70,000 Americans had been killed or wounded in the war. In 1968, Richard Nixon campaigned on ending the Vietnam War. He announced withdrawal plans in 1969 and then again in 1971 before finally withdrawing in December of 1973. 5 years after making the promise to the American people that he would end the war.
I implemented a plan to train and equip the South Vietnamese to withdraw American forces and to end American involvement in the war just as soon as the South Vietnamese had developed the capacity to defend their country against communist aggression. Now, on this chart on my right, you can see how our plan has succeeded. In June of 1969, I announced a withdrawal of 25,000 men. In September, 40,000. December, 50,000. April of 1970, 150,000. By the 1st of next month, May 1st, we will have brought home more than 265,000 Americans, almost half of the troops in Vietnam, when I took office. Every action taken by this administration, every decision made, has accomplished what I said it would accomplish. They have reduced American involvement. They have drastically reduced our casualties. And generations in the future will look back at this difficult, trying time in America's history, and they will be proud that we demonstrated that we had the courage and the character of a great people.
Now, though he withdrew the troops, thousands of American support stayed on the ground until the actual end of the war in 1975. By then, Nixon had resigned, and Ford was left holding the bag. And in the last half of April 1975, with the North rapidly approaching Saigon, the Navy and Air Force rapidly evacuated 130,000 high-risk Vietnamese American citizens and their families. Jimmy Carter, now he gets to make the claim that under his watch, the U.S. never dropped a bomb, never fired a bullet, never went to war. He asserts that he kept his promise. And although this is technically true, it was Carter it was Carter and it was Reagan who then ramped up Operation Cyclone, the program which funded, trained, and armed the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And that Mujahideen ended up becoming Al-Qaeda and Taliban. So Carter and Reagan are largely responsible for what happens next. The two Bushes, Clinton, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, have been going back and forth, declaring war, declaring an end to the war, declaring war again, and going around and around in rhetoric circles with their sights squarely aimed at Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria. Starting with Iraq. In January of 1991, George Sr. declared war on the nation, citing their invasion of Kuwait. 1 month, 1 week, and 4 days later of intense airstrikes and fighting, Bush Sr. declared victory.
5 short weeks ago, I came to this House to speak to you about the State of the Union, and we met then in time of war. Tonight, we meet in a world blessed by the promise of peace. From the moment Operation Desert Storm commenced on January 16th Until the time the guns fell silent at midnight 1 week ago, this nation has watched its sons and daughters with pride, watched over them with prayer. As Commander-in-Chief, I can report to you our armed forces fought with honor and valor. And as President, I can report to the nation, aggression is defeated, the war is over.
Hear that? Peace in Iraq. Bush Sr. But the war didn't really end. Under Clinton, major airstrikes continued to be carried out against Iraq throughout the decade, the most significant being in 1993, 1996, and 1998, all without him declaring war. Now, Clinton was a smooth talker, and he didn't like to make promises he couldn't keep, so he just didn't make very many. Now, the younger Bush, he came along and in 2003, like father, like son, declared war on Iraq, this time citing weapons of mass destruction. And after exactly 1 month, 1 week, and 4 days of intense airstrike and fighting, Bush Jr. declared victory.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed. Because of you, our nation is more secure. Because of you, the tyrant has fallen and Iraq is free.
Deja vu. But as we know, that wasn't the end of that war. It kept going and going until finally Barack Obama did the thing we had been waiting for. In 2011, he announced an end to the Iraq War. But after much fanfare and drama, unfortunately, that wasn't really the end either. In 2014, Obama deployed troops to Iraq once again, this time to stop ISIS. So then Trump came along and promised to finally be the president to completely withdraw the troops and end the oil wars in the Middle East. But instead, he ended up not ending the war after all and left behind 2,500 of our armed forces, which is not a complete withdrawal. He also promised to get us out of Syria. And after removing the troops, he doubled back and sent hundreds in to guard the oil. So much for the promise of ending oil wars. And this takes us to Afghanistan. Now, while Bush was declaring mission accomplished in Iraq, May of 2003, Donald Rumsfeld was also claiming the U.S. was ending major combat missions in Afghanistan and shifted to nation building. Well, 2 years later, we went back into combat. Fast forward to Obama, who campaigned on ending the war in Afghanistan. And what do you know? To our shock and amazement, in 2011, Obama declared an end to the war in Afghanistan. He had kept his promise.
Today, I signed a historic agreement between the United States and Afghanistan that defines a new kind of relationship between our countries, a future in which Afghans are responsible for the security of their nation, and we build an equal partnership between two sovereign states. A future in which war ends and a new chapter begins.
Well, rather than the war ending, it instead continued on. And in 2013, Obama once again promised to end the war in Afghanistan by December of 2014.
We've dealt devastating blows to al-Qaeda. We've pushed the Taliban out of their strongholds. And our core objective, the reason we went to war in the first place, is now within reach, ensuring that al-Qaeda can never again use Afghanistan to launch attacks against America. The 33,000 additional forces that I ordered to Afghanistan served with honor. They completed their mission and, as promised, returned home last fall. This week, we agreed that this spring, Afghan forces will take the lead for security across the entire country, and our troops will shift to a support role.
So back to Trump, who ran on ending wars. He got into the Oval Office, talked a big game, but then in 2019 said, quote, "My original instinct was to pull out, and historically I like following my instincts, but all of my life I heard that decisions are much different when you sit behind the desk in the Oval Office," unquote. Nonetheless, he still proclaimed that the war in Afghanistan would be over by Christmas of 2020. And did that happen? Nope. Instead, he just cut the troop numbers down to 2,500 like he did in Iraq and failed to actually end the war. So here we are today. Biden has promised to end this war in Afghanistan like many who have come before him. And though he declared an end, we're still not out. And who knows, we might not be for a while. But you know, guys, Alyssa and Ryan, this just kind of shows that these promises are an American tradition. This has been going on for a really, really long time, of president after president promising to end war and then having to backtrack. And a lot of these wars we've just continued on in forever and ever. I'd like to remind you that we're still not technically done with the Korean War. That one is still technically on the books. So, I mean, hopefully this time Biden's actually going to get us out of the troops, out of Afghanistan. I'd like to hear from you, Ryan, if you think that this time will really, truly be it.
Yeah, I think one of the purposes of learning history and learning from our history is to be able to identify when things are different than they've been in the past. And I think the reaction that you've seen from the media and from the national security establishment over the last week is proof, in a way, that this actually is different. They are panicking. They are absolutely losing their minds because they thought they had the script written, and the script is the one that you just laid out so effectively, which is that you kind of say you're going to end the war, but you don't really end the war. You mollify the American public that wants these endless wars to end. They believe for a year or two that they're over, then they're like, wait a minute, you said you're going to end that war, but the war's still going on. Why is that happening? And so the military successfully did that with Trump. They punted it all the way until he was out of office. And they thought, with good reason, I think, that they were going to be able to do the same with Biden. Instead, he pulled out of there. It's true that there are troops now in there guarding the airport and shepherding the evacuation of Americans and allies. But I think that is materially and fundamentally different than the type of occupations that you talked about here. Alyssa, I mean, what do you think?
So I'm actually bullish that we're going to end up keeping a pretty significant residual force in Afghanistan. We'll check back in a couple of weeks because, Ryan's on the other side of this. But one thing I would know, this is a fantastic deep dive that you did, Kim, is we need a foreign policy visionary somewhere in elected government in the U.S. to just fundamentally come out and say you could get bogged down in the Middle East forever. There is always going to be another conflict that you could convince the U.S. there's a reason to get drawn into. The closest I would say is actually General Mattis, the national defense strategy that he released when he was Secretary of Defense, basically made the case, look, we're always going to have threats that emerge from the Middle East. We can deal with them on, a rapid deployment basis if we need to, if there's a threat to the homeland. But we need to be focusing on next generation threats from China and from Russia. So long as we're tied up in these never-ending wars in the Middle East, we're actually allowing the real adversaries who pose a threat to us to gain steam, and we're not prepared to take them on. But nobody's really making that case. Maybe that's the discussion that's going to follow these weeks of chaos in Afghanistan. But fascinating deep dive. We shall see. Will there be 5,000 troops in Afghanistan much longer? Only time will tell.
Yeah. All right. Well, there's more Rising coming up next.